For this session, we're going to have a panel discussion on the very interesting topic of consciousness. We have 4 discussants, and Olivia Carter will be doing a little introduction. And I have the pleasure to introduce Olivia. She's a professor in our school and a member of the Cognitive Neuroscience Hub. And she does a lot of interesting work on consciousness and psychedelics. And you'll hear more about her work in a minute. And then she will introduce the other speakers for today. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy.
Thanks. And towards the end, I'll re-emphasise this, but the second half will really be open questions and discussions with you all. So think about questions you have, and definitely ask them towards the end. Okay, so I did just want to start. This is probably, I've been in the world of consciousness and illusions for a very long time. This is my very favourite one. If you haven't seen this before, just focus on the black square for a while. You've got to keep your eyes fixated on the black square. And after some period of time, hopefully the pink dots will disappear from awareness, and you'll see a green dot cycling around. Okay, hopefully you've got to keep your eyes still. Has anyone got to the point where all they're seeing is a green dot? Okay, there's a few hands. Okay, so this is obviously, so now if you move your eyes around, you should see the only thing that's ever being presented are the pink dots, and there'll be a point in time where the only thing you're actually aware of is the one thing that's not there. So to me, this is a really, really strong example, I guess, of the problem of consciousness. How is the brain constructing these internal experiences that do not always perfectly connect with the outside world? Just another really quick example, and just to make the point, people often ask, do you think people, we're all experiencing the world the same way? One thing I find really fascinating and interesting is that not only are we not all experiencing the world the same way, you yourself are not experiencing the world the same way. And if you look at the 2 points in the middle, one normally looks purplish, one looks yellow. If you remove all the context, they're both grey. So these sorts of illusions, I think, really powerful in terms of illustrating how much work your brain is doing, I guess, to create these internal representations. All right, so hopefully that got you at least interested. To put a little bit of context, I guess this panel was called The Hard Problem of Consciousness, and it is useful. I normally include these slides in the undergraduate lectures to explain what it is that scientists mean when they're talking about the problem of consciousness. And David Chalmers, who was a famous Australian philosopher, we've got another, of course, Tim here, another famous Australian philosopher, but David made a major contribution to the field, distinguishing the easy problem and the hard problem. The easy problem is really the difference between total unconsciousness versus anything more than that, really trying to understand what activity in the brain is changing to that in line with these conscious experiences. The hard problem is really trying to understand how is it that thing that has been identified as correlating or relevant to consciousness, how is it generating the experience? Really, really explaining how it is that consciousness arises from these brain changes. And I think most scientists, maybe not every scientist, but I think most scientists think the hard problem is too hard and the easy problem is hard enough. Maybe there's others disagree and think they're tackling the hard problem. But here, what I've asked the panelists to focus on is think a little bit more about, I've named it the really hard problem, but that's just because I needed to distinguish from the hard problem, which already exists. But really thinking about sort of consciousness science outside of the lab or outside of the sort of philosophical discussions, and just thinking about how this field of consciousness science is relevant to the real world in any way, shape or form. So we've got very different perspectives here, and we'll talk through them in a second. Personally, I'm sort of really interested in these types of sort of questions. Is consciousness all or none? Is it graded in intensity? Is it integrated in breadth or both, and what would it mean for a system to have more or less consciousness, and along what dimensions can consciousness states be altered. So I've done a lot of work looking in meditation and psychedelics and different clinical populations, and happy to chat more about that in the discussion. So what I've now given my little 5-minute sort of spiel, and what I've asked the panelists to do is to talk a little bit about their personal sort of how it is they came to be interested in consciousness, or where they come from before it, because I'll go through and give their nice formal titles, but I think the real sort of background is more interesting. And just to talk for 5 minutes or so about anything they would like to, really. But ideally, sort of why should we care about consciousness, or the implications for the outside of the lab, or anything at all in that manner. So the first speaker we have is Tim Bayne. Oh, I've written the titles without the people's names. Sorry. Okay. So luckily there's photos, otherwise this would be very useless. So Tim Bayne, Professor of Philosophy, I should say. This is also what's on the web at the moment. So he's at the School of he's at the Department of Philosophy, that'll do, at Monash University. And then we'll move on to Professor Wendyl D'Souza, a clinician, so an epileptologist, who I struggled to say those words, Associate Professor of Neuroepidemiology and Health Services Research, Department of Medicine, University of Melbourne, Head of Epilepsy Services at St Vincent's Hospital. To give a more clinical perspective, you've just heard from me, and I'm a proud member of the Cognitive Neuroscience Hub. Yes. And Anil Seth, who has joined us here as a Brotherton Fellow. This is one of possibly last formal engagement of a very intense 3 weeks. Maybe not. I don't know, we've got 2 more days to squeeze some stuff out of him. Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience, Director of the Centre for Consciousness Science, University of Sussex. So I'll sit down and hand it over to Tim to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about.
Well, it's probably bad form, but I think I might have to begin by correcting you, Olivia.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm neither famous nor Australian.
Oh.
I don't know which of those things is more important, but yeah, I'm from New Zealand for my sins. So, yeah, I'm interested in both philosophical and, I guess, scientific aspects of consciousness, and one of the things that's particularly important, I think, for me, is that often it's difficult to separate the philosophical and scientific aspects of consciousness out. I mean, in some sense, a philosophical question is one that you can't resolve by doing an experiment, and a scientific question is one that you can. But that nice and tidy way of dividing things up kind of falls apart when you look at many issues related to consciousness, for a variety of reasons. I mean, one of which relates to the hard problem issue, easy problem that Olivia mentioned, which is a lot of the debates about consciousness turn at some fundamental sense on one's conception of consciousness, if you like, the definition of consciousness that you're working with. And if you think of consciousness purely in observable or information processing or third-person terms, as in ability to respond to the environment or a stimulus in flexible ways, then a lot of the issues relating to consciousness aren't easy, but they're tractable, and that's what Chalmers meant by the easy problem. Whereas if your approach to consciousness is first and foremost as something that involves private experience that you may or may not be able to put into words, but you know what it's like to taste strawberries, you know what it's like to feel annoyance when you're stuck in traffic, and you've got these experiences, these subjective experiences that you're acquainted with in some sort of direct, privileged way from your own perspective. And then the challenges for a scientific point of view is to work out, well, how can we study those? How can we study those things, given that science requires reproducibility, requires objectivity, requires being able to look at things from different perspectives. And so that's that's why I think there's so much interaction and so much richness at the interface between philosophy and science. So I'm particularly interested in measuring consciousness, or the detection of consciousness in hard cases. So, I take it that you're conscious. I think you've got reason to take it that I'm conscious. But there are lots of cases where there's a kind of genuine uncertainty, not like a philosophical, skeptical uncertainty in the same way there's uncertainty about the existence of the external world. No one seriously doubts that the external world exists, except when you're in the philosophy seminar. But there is genuine, as it were, genuine everyday uncertainty about when consciousness first emerges in infancy, about the distribution of consciousness in non-human animals. And there will increasingly be genuine uncertainty, it seems to me, about the presence of consciousness in AI systems. And that's got ethical, legal, public policy implications. So that's sort of, those are the issues that I'm particularly interested in. That was probably more than 5 minutes.
That's good. Perfect.
So my name's Wendyl D'Souza. I'm an epileptologist. It's really an epilepsy specialist, neurologist, and also an epidemiologist. But I come from it really from the easy question, which for me is really hard actually. So I talk to people about their experiences to try and understand what's happening with them. I observe their experiences as well, and we actually bring them in to a hospital sometimes to observe them. And now with the state-of-the-art wearables, which we are a big part of here with Department of Engineering here in Melbourne, we have developed ways of observing people for 24 hours, for 7 days in hospital, for 7 days in their home, with brainwave recordings and video recordings. And we've also now developed ways of looking for that even long term, which are a little bit more invasive, where we implant things initially on their brain surface and looked at people for 2 years and seeing what actually happens with audio and brainwave recordings without video. And now we've gone to something which is not on their brain surface, but actually just below in this what's called their subgaleal space between their scalp and their bone. And we are now measuring what is happening we've got maybe 30 patients, looking at them for now over 12 months. And so that brings with it a whole new realm of seeing things which we never saw before, and also challenging what people have told us and what they've observed, or other people have observed, for us actually observing them and knowing what may be happening in front of their eyes, and it's actually thrown everything out of the window. So for us, the simple problem for me was there's people having seizures. So we would ask them, and they would have these events often in childhood where they would pause and then start up again. They don't know the bit that they've missed out, and they don't know, and they don't have any warning before, and they don't feel any different afterwards. And we would just see that every now and then because it happened lots. And then in people's adolescence, it would also start up, but they would have it very infrequently. So they don't know what's happening. No one really sees what's happening. And they're also driving motor vehicles. So a really kind of easy and simple problem, which becomes a bit more challenging when no one knows what's actually happening. And unfortunately or fortunately now, we're observing this more and more and more as we have wearables, and we're finding their brainwave recordings being off the air for 3 seconds, 10 seconds, 24 seconds, half a day. Sometimes they're doing stuff and often they're not. And so for us, it's not really the hard problem of consciousness, it's the problem of interacting and responding to your environment in a way that you can drive a motor vehicle, you can take in information when you're in class, and those sorts of issues. So that's where I came with consciousness, purely from the fact that I'm also an epidemiologist, so I look at motor vehicle accidents around the country, and I've had many patients who have, turned their trucks over, smashed up beautiful historical churches. And that's a real problem, that we don't know when they lose consciousness and when they're able to do it. And we're observing these periods of brainwave short-circuiting and don't know when they actually lose perception, lose consciousness, lose awareness, whatever a term you want to use. The other way we look at it as well is that we do something which is even much more invasive. I try and fix people's epilepsy when the medicines don't work, and in 30% of people it doesn't work. So we bring them into hospital and we implant their brains with fine wires to look at different, aspects of their temporal lobe, their occipital lobe, their frontal lobe, and observe some of these. Some of them are primitive experiences or more simple experiences like, lights flashing, but then sometimes those experiences are much more complex, and they have a experiential quality, like something they've had before, like we call déjà vu, or some other auditory phenomena, or sometimes it's a music or a song that they've heard. So we implant their brain not to understand those things, but it's a byproduct of trying to find out, is there some mark in their brain that we can take out, or a portion of their brain that's part of an electrical network that we can ablate the hub or generator, and all of their seizures will stop, and they'll actually be able to have an ability to not lose awareness and get back to all the things they want to do. And during that time, we observe their seizures, we see what's happening in the deep structures of their brain, and we also stimulate the parts of their brain to reproduce their habitual seizures, and sometimes we also reproduce their non-habitual seizures and find areas of the brain which we never could access before like this, and try and understand the complexity of how these seizures start and progress and bring in other structures in their brain. So for me, it's a kind of a simple, I'm trying to help people get back on with their lives, but for me, it's a very complex problem.
No, I'm done. It's for you.
It's me. All right, thank you. Thanks, Wendyl. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Olivia. First thing I want to say is I've really enjoyed being in Melbourne for the last 3 weeks. Thank you very much, Olivia and Melbourne University, for bringing me here on this Brotherton Fellowship, and it's been really among the most fruitful 2 or 3 weeks I can remember intellectually. It's also been a lot of fun, and what struck me is a depth and the breadth of expertise around consciousness, also cognitive neuroscience at Melbourne, and also Monash, if we're allowed to say that.
You're allowed to say
in
that.
Current company. And so it's been brilliant, and I'm sure it will continue to be even more brilliant. And this depth and breadth of approaches, of methodology, we've already heard of diversity. I mean, for me, that's one of the things that attracted me and has kept me engaged in consciousness research all my career as well, because perhaps not uniquely, but certainly characteristically, consciousness is not a problem that can be intellectually siloed. Tim mentioned that this tidy way of separating science and philosophy doesn't apply. It also doesn't apply between the scientific disciplines, between clinical disciplines, between psychology, between neuroscience. When I was starting out, I was always interested in consciousness. I think we all are at some level. Like, why am I me? What happens when I die? These questions everybody asks of themselves at some point. But when I was starting out in the 90s as a student, there was no sort of track to study this. It was considered pretty illegitimate. And so my own trajectory was very kind of a random walk, really, that ended up here. So I started off doing physics, then psychology, then PhD in computer science and AI, only then neuroscience, and never actually philosophy sort of formally as any part of this. But that kind of trajectory, I think it's worth mentioning because it's still true today. So people come and end up in consciousness science from a whole diversity of backgrounds, and that's part of what makes it, I think, really rich and really interesting. And these disciplines are talking to each other much more now, I think, than they used to. So philosophers like Tim are incredibly fluent with the neuroscience, which wasn't the case 30 years ago. And the same with clinicians, and the same the other way around. So this is for me very, very exciting. Now, so my own approach to consciousness is certainly, I don't think, unique by any means, and it's sort of this middle ground between the easy and the hard problems, which I've sort of called the real problem, partly to piss David Chalmers off a little bit, not too much. And it's a way of saying, look, we can start to chip away at this apparently intractable mystery by explaining properties of conscious experiences, not just that they happen or that you see X rather than Y, but the way in which a visual experience is the way it is and different from an emotional experience or an experience of agency or volition. If you can start to explain these relations in a richer way that's not just a mere correlation, then I think the sense of mystery surrounding consciousness as a problem begins to dissolve. And a very kind of brute parallel to this is life. So at one point, life was considered beyond the reach of science. There was some élan vital, some special spark of life. But of course, that turned out not to be necessary, and by just treating life as many related problems, not just one big scary problem, the hard problem of life began to dissolve. And I don't know whether the same thing will happen with consciousness, but what I am confident about is that we will make a lot of progress, relevant progress, anyway, even if some residue of hard problem remains at the end. So in terms of practical ways, this moves on nicely to, well, what apart from just existential satisfaction, what's the point? And I think there's many applications, and I think this is really the future, is seeing how consciousness science, now that it's a sort of well-established, legitimate field of multidisciplinary study, seeing its impact, not just in other parts of academia, but in the world. So in my case, understanding, for instance, why visual experiences are the way they are has an immediate implications for understanding visual hallucinations and other forms of mental and psychiatric illness, which are presently pretty poorly understood in medicine. There's, of course, implications in neurology in terms of measuring the presence of consciousness in absent seizures and coma, vegetative state, and so on. So this is something I'm actively working on. There are also implications for healthy people too. So one of the things I'm really fascinated at the moment is understanding that our experiences all differ in some way. And we can know this in the abstract, but it's very hard to really appreciate the consequences of this, because often our experiences don't differ so much that we use different words, and of course it seems to us we see the world as it is. It doesn't seem to us that we construct it. So I'm fascinated by measuring, mapping this thing. There's this quick shout out to this project called the Perception Census, which I would love you to take part in. We're closing on Tuesday. To try and map out this space and understand also its social consequences. And then finally, in just the last 20 seconds, there are increasingly implications that I think are more foundational for society, and they're harder to address because we don't have definitive answers in the same way we might do, or we're beginning to do in other areas of application, like measuring it in a vegetative state or so on. And these are the things Tim hinted at. What can we say about consciousness beyond the human in non-human animals? What can we say about consciousness during development? And what can we say about consciousness in relation to the law? Law in most countries is based on a known to be wrong premise that we are, we have this kind of rational mind and the means to do something. And it's sort of based on Cartesian dualistic premise of it's known to be basically wrong, but that's still how the law works. Understanding the neural basis of free will or volition, voluntary experience and agency is increasingly having an impact in the law. So that's another area which I think is we'll see more there. And then, of course, finally, because there's much hubris about it at the moment, AI. And here I think it's really, I'm thinking a lot about two separate worries here. One is how would we tell whether AI might have consciousness? I think is extremely unlikely, because I think consciousness is intimately tied to our nature as living systems. We're not just meat-based computers that roll around from one meeting to another. But we will live in a world where we interact with artificial systems that seem to us to have conscious minds. We're almost already there for some people. And that in itself is going to be socially very disruptive. So the message there, I think the last message I want to convey is, even if we don't know how consciousness works, understanding it incrementally still will affect our debates and our policies and our decisions in all these areas in ways that matter. And we should make sure that we have a voice in the room for these things, even if it's not a solution to the hard problem.
Thanks. A question for Anil. I thought, very striking analogy between the hard problem of life and the hard problem of consciousness, and you suggested that the hard problem of life effectively dissolved because it was chipped away by people asking relatively modest, tractable, answerable scientific questions, so questions that could be asked and answered within the scope of an experiment. Wouldn't the implication then that the best way of making progress on the problem of consciousness be in a similar way, not to talk about consciousness, but talk about the stuff that we can ask and answer scientific questions about?
Sort of. People will differ, and I'd be very interested what the other panel members think about this. I think if you don't talk about consciousness at all, you're missing the point entirely. And part of the problem has been a resistance to talk about consciousness because of this thought that doing so means addressing the hard problem. I think it's perfectly possible to talk about consciousness in terms of the ways experiences are, different kinds of experiences, and the fact that they come and go in anesthesia and absences and things like that, while still not trying to answer the hard problem directly. So I think this is why it's really a kind of middle ground. And in the example of life, people were still extremely interested in life, and they still talked about life, but they just analyzed its properties like metabolism and so on. The analogy is not perfect, of course. The main disanalogy is that living things you can still examine objectively and share evidence about, whereas conscious experiences are intrinsically subjective and private. But that for me is a bit of a separate issue that makes the problem more experimentally, methodologically difficult, but doesn't change the way I think we should approach it. But I don't know what you think about this.
I don't have this feeling that it's just going to dissolve one magical day that'll poof and disappear. But I look back, I think over the last 20 years, a lot of people have been working in this space, and I wouldn't say that most of them are tackling the hard problem. I'd say most of them are not. It's really the easy problem. And on the one hand, you feel like there's not an answer, that's unsatisfying. But I think back in the last 20 years, I feel like a huge amount of progress has been made, and there's a lot of convergence, even really different theories, picking up important sort of elements of complexity of brain states, different roles of different parts of the brain. Thalamus is clearly more important than other areas in terms of these things. So on the one hand, it's not the case that everyone says, there's the answer. But I feel like, and particularly sort of moving towards a more clinical context, I feel like we're getting closer to having meaningful measures or having a sense of what types of brain signatures we need to look at. So I don't know if this will continue for another 20 years and everyone will feel like it's solved, but I feel like we're making progress. So I don't know if that really answers the question as such, but I feel like progress can be made.
To follow up the question to Anil, say something is sort of pedestrian and well studied as binocular rivalry, which psychophysicists have been studying forever and have a very good handle on how it works and what its determinants are. The typical psychophysicist would talk about this in very guarded terms, in terms of reportable percepts. And so the question is, that's now being repurposed as a paradigm to study consciousness. So are the benefits in thinking about it in these broader consciousness terms, or I guess my own sense is that I would remain cautious and talk about it precisely in terms of reportable percepts and understanding the structure of those.
Yeah, so Olivia's done a lot of the work on binocular rivalry.
I know, that's why I picked that one up. It wasn't accidental.
But it's part of course one has to be careful about the language used to interpret these kinds of results. But it is striking that indeed, things like binocular rivalry, indeed the lilac chaser illusion that Olivia showed at the beginning, dissociates stimulus from experience in interesting ways. There is a another perennial problem of identifying the mechanisms underpinning experience compared to those underpinning report and other kinds of behavior. But this, for me, is why it's not merely enough to look at correlations. You have to have explanatory relations that say this kind of mechanism goes along with this kind of experience for non-arbitrary reasons, not just that it is conscious versus not. And so I think you can make progress there. But yeah, of course, you've got to be very cautious, and no single paradigm is going to be sufficient. But binocular rivalry has been and continues to be, I think, really quite helpful.
But do you get any more explanatory purchase if you think about mechanisms? If the goal, and I agree, is to understand mechanisms, you get any more explanatory purchase by talking about this in terms of consciousness as opposed to in more circumscribed and guarded terms of reported percepts?
Well, then I think we're just around semantics, right? I mean, I think reportable percept implies consciousness.
Sometimes.
For humans. Yeah. For humans most of the time.
Firstly, what other species do you think have consciousness? And the second one is, in human babies or fetuses, at what point do you personally think consciousness emerges? Do you each have a view on those two, what I think are absolutely key questions?
Let's let Tim kick off with that one then.
Tim is...
Well, I have published views.
Yeah.
But I may or may not agree with them. I guess I think it's likely that most non-human species are conscious, but I think my credence in that claim is very low.
Just animals?
What do you mean, just animals?
So most other species, like where
animals.
You draw the line with animals?
Yeah, sure. I'm not talking about plants or anything. Yeah. So
because apparently some people
have
drawn the line more broadly. Is that right?
You can find, the logical space is fully tiled. You can find any position. You can find someone serious who's at least toyed with it. So yeah, the first thing I would want to say is I don't think we've got a lot of evidence, and I certainly don't think we've got a lot of evidence for lots of things that that qualifies as received, like received results, that someone can stand up in a court of law and say, science has shown, or the balance of probabilities, this is, as it were, beyond reasonable doubt. I don't, I think one can find serious, thoughtful people who would reject, there are serious positions, there are serious, thoughtful people who think that consciousness doesn't extend much beyond human beings. I don't agree with them, but I don't, I think that's a position that needs to be reckoned with. So, if one's looking to the science of consciousness and for received results where we have, the community has shown X, I think on this issue, there's not a whole lot to be said. There's a balance of probabilities. I think there's a consensus that most mammals would be conscious, and many non-mammalian species. On the fetal infant question, I think consciousness is probably there from birth in some rudimentary form, and I use the word consciousness, not self-consciousness. So I would want to make a distinction, and I think that distinction is often obscured in discussions of these things. I think probably many of the mechanisms required for consciousness are present in late third trimester, but I suspect that in utero they're generally, perhaps always suppressed, so that there's a capacity there that isn't allowed to be actualized by the environment. But I think there's a few tantalizing pieces of evidence that maybe suggest that sometimes consciousness is present, late in pregnancy. But I don't think that's all I would say. There's a couple of them, and they're tantalizing. So I think on both the animal issue and the developmental question, like many of these questions, what we've got is promissory notes. We've got lots of avenues of research. So what I'm an optimist about is the future. I think we've got tools, conceptual tools, data gathering tools that might help make serious progress, but I don't think we have made a huge amount of progress on those issues to date. I think we've made some, but I wouldn't say we've got received views. But, I don't know. What do other people think?
Do you have anything to add to the...
not really, actually. Neurology is full of the hard questions, and I think I agree with Anil, the more that we have multidisciplinaries looking at these issues, we're left to making these hard problems every day, but we don't even touch on those problems because they're too hard often, Who goes on a life support machine? Who gets taken off a life support machine? When do we even give them any treatment at all? When are we allowing them to have their wishes met when they can't respond at that time? And those are really difficult everyday problems that we have. And because we're so busy, we need to have these cross disciplines to come in and look at the things while we are gaining greater expertise at looking at the hardware, to look at this thing above the hardware. And the more we're able to look at the hardware, I think we will actually get to another place. We may not get to the answer of the hard problem, but we'll at least be able to make those questions and interrogate some of them.
So my question is, there has been, also for the entire panel, there has been a lot of discussion around theories of consciousness recently and which one is the best, and letters have been written. So what is a theory of consciousness that would satisfy you? So, or what features does a theory of consciousness have to have?
Who's going to take this question? I might.
Mine, obviously. Mine satisfies me. Doesn't satisfy anybody else, though.
It's a good question. It's a good point. We've got Anil here. It would be rude. It would be just plain rude.
It would be rude to not insist that Anil's theory is by far the...
In a very civilized way. Let's try to address
I think Olivia signed a letter, right?
Maybe
I asked the question to Olivia. Why do you hate IIT?
A letter?
Yeah. I've never heard about a letter.
No one's writing me letters.
I'm flat out going to refuse to talk about it. I'll talk about it with anyone one-to-one.
Over a coffee.
But
I think we might take the next question.
No, one thing, just to say something in response to that. I think without picking on particular theories, I think it is a good question about what are we looking for when we want to say we have a satisfactory theory in hand? And I think intuitions do differ about this. And one of the interesting ways I think these intuitions differ is that should it provide this like kind of aha, that's right feeling? And I think there's something potentially distinctive about consciousness here. Like we don't ask that of theories always in other domains of science. Like quantum mechanics doesn't give you that aha, that's right, because no one can even agree what it means. But it's a very, very good theory because it makes very, very clear testable predictions that stand up and that do explain certain things if you can get your head around them. I think there's a thing that because we ourselves are conscious, we might set a higher bar for the intuitive level of satisfaction we expect a theory to deliver than we do in other domains. And I don't know if that can be justified, but it might be an element. And it might not be necessary, right? A successful, satisfactory theory in general need not do that, so long as it doesn't necessarily contradict. If it says, like, if I have a theory that says that I am not conscious, then it's not going to be particularly satisfying to me.
So I'm sympathetic to a lot of that. I would add one thing that I think hasn't been as widely appreciated as I think it should be in these discussions, which is most theories of consciousness have an incredibly impoverished data set. in some sense, it's sort of n is 1. And it's actually kind of n is not even 1 in some sense, because they purport, at least usually they're read as being about theories of consciousness in general, like all forms of consciousness. They're not theories, or they're not usually read as theories of consciousness in me, or theories of consciousness in you, or people in this room. They're not theories of human consciousness, they're not theories of mammalian consciousness, they're meant to be theories of consciousness. And yet, the evidential source for the vast majority of theories, there are some interesting and notable exceptions, is not just human beings, because we can't really study, or at least the data from, as it were, difficult populations, like infants, vegetative state patients, people in deep sleep, people in sedation, that doesn't come, it's not the primary data source for theories. Primarily theories of consciousness, the data source is adult, neurotypical, in some very inclusive sense of neurotypical, human beings. So it's, one species and not the full range of individuals of that species. You generalize from that, you get a theory of consciousness, and then the implication seems to be, we've got a theory of consciousness in all conditions. And you just have to think about that for 5 seconds to think that's kind of crazy. Even generalizing just from human beings to a full theory of consciousness would be difficult enough, because you've got to say, well, maybe consciousness in mice or insects is very different in structure, form, function, all sorts of properties from human consciousness. But we don't even have the full range of human experience as a primary data source for theories of consciousness. And I think that lesson hasn't really sunk in to the community. And so I would prefer, and I realize I'm on a hobby horse here, but I would prefer a lot of theorists to be much more circumspect and sort of say, yeah, okay, we've got a theory of consciousness. I'd love it if it were true of a theory of all conscious systems, but really, I don't have much reason to think it's much better than a theory of human consciousness, and maybe just neurotypical adult human beings in the waking state, which is where 99.9% of my data derives from. So a bit of humility, I think, would go a long way towards perhaps diffusing some of the consciousness wars.
I'm going to launch in actually respond in some way as well, which I might regret later. But just I think it's sort of agreeing a bit with Tim, and also to distinguish the judgment calls around theories versus a much more specific question regarding testability of set claim. And I'm not sure if that's kind of along with lines what Tim was saying in terms of impoverished data set. So I think it is an important question about the testability of a claim, regardless of what the claim is. For it to be scientific, it has to be testable. Personally, I'd also say that science, there's limits to what's scientifically tractable. I think there can be truths that are not scientifically testable or provable but there's limits to science. And I'm not necessarily saying I think that consciousness is, I don't personally think that consciousness is something that is unscientifically studyable. But there is this confusion, I think, in the field around sort of grand claims and theories and what theory is right or what theory is wrong versus a much more individual, specific claims about testability. But I think it would be good if there's a scientific study that's testing a claim that it's written up as such, so I think it's the testability is the bigger issue rather than theory. That it's true for every theory, and I think there might be theories that are very difficult to test. There might be theories that are impossible to test.
Yeah, and I also wonder whether they're impossible to test or we just don't know how to test it.
Or maybe we don't have data, so it might be currently untestable.
Yeah. Because, of course, the Higgs boson for a long time was a prediction that, nobody could find it. And finally they did it. That was pretty massive, right?
I guess following on from that, the neural correlates of consciousness seem to be relatively replicable for like access consciousness, which is maybe more like cognition, but phenomenality seems much more difficult to pin down. And then when we look at like single-celled organisms and like the way they move, it seems that they're very, I don't like, it's intuition, but it seems like they're somewhat like conscious, or they have like direction and movement. So I'm just wondering if what everyone thinks about whether a brain is essential for consciousness, phenomenal consciousness.
I think it is. I think I'll stick my neck out there and think brains are necessary, at least in the space of biological systems as we have them. But it is one of the things you mentioned is something that actually comes from a question earlier about where we draw the line, and there is these things that we have these both anthropomorphic and anthropocentric tendencies. So we will see things through a human lens and we'll project human-like qualities into things. So if we look at single-cell organism, we might project qualities into it like agency and so on, which it might not actually have. It might be a very, very simple mechanism that's generating something that just exercises our anthropomorphic tendencies. And so that's just one of these things that I think we have to almost guard against, or just recognize when we're making judgments without a completely reliable evidence base about what is and what is not consciousness. And we've learned to do that a bit already, as I think came up earlier, that at one time language was considered to be a signature of consciousness and maybe necessary for consciousness. And we've walked back from that claim because that's overly anthropocentric, right? That's saying that something that is so distinctively human, that that can't be the case. So now it's more like, okay, we know the brain mechanisms in mammals, it looks similar to the brain mechanisms in humans that are implicated, so that's fine. So I think we can incrementally get away from these anthropomorphic and anthropocentric tendencies, but they will always be there, and even in things like single-celled organisms. Because the opposite applies too. If they don't exercise our anthropomorphic biases, we can not attribute qualities to something that might in fact have it. So here I'm thinking about things like brain organoids, which don't look as they do anything most of the time. But who knows?
I have a question on that. So I don't know what brains are, in the sense that I don't know if brain organoids have brains or are brains. I mean, it sounds like a dumb question, it sounds like I'm being facetious, but I'm actually quite serious. So if you say brains are or aren't essential for consciousness, is a simulation of a brain, at what level of functional analysis do you have to duplicate your brain, my brain, a mouse brain to get a brain? Does it have to be hooked up to a body? Does it have to have been hooked up to a body to be a brain? So, Anil and I, a few years ago, wrote a paper about ex-cranio brains that have been pulled out and put in a vat. Are they still brains? I mean, you kind of think that they are brains, but are they brains in virtue of having been brains, i.e. embodied controlling systems or a part of the control system for an organism? What if you had something like that never had been part of an organism? Now, these sounds like questions that only a philosopher could care about, and maybe that's true. But if they kind of matter, if you then say, well, you've got to have a brain or be a brain to be conscious. Because if you don't have an account in your back pocket of what a brain is and what it takes to have a brain, then you haven't said anything by saying you need a brain or have to be a brain or have a brain to be conscious. So, and as we get closer to AI systems that are going to look like brains at some level of analysis, but not at others, questions about how to generalize the term or the concept brain beyond us to other systems are going to start to be important. They're semantic questions, but that don't mean that they don't matter. Semantics matters in this because they're big carrying weight about attributions or ascriptions of consciousness. Your Honour, it can't be conscious because it doesn't have a brain. Well, what's a brain? That's the...
I mean, do you think you need the whole brain? I mean, or do you... obviously,
split brain research from
that's right.
about in the 50s, early 60s.
I would sort of even be a bit more provocative and say you need... I really want my cortex. epilepsy is the study of the cortex. That's why I do it.
Yeah.
Because it is a cortical phenomena. Obviously, you need the thalamus as well. But I don't think personally, and I'm not a neuroscientist like my esteemed people on this panel are. But the cortex is, I would say, would be the essential part of consciousness.
But there are, again, there's a rich variety of positions on this. Intuitively, I'm attracted to that too, and certainly there's a rich relationship between cortex and specific concepts of consciousness. But there are sensible people out there who would defend the claim that actually, that's just the icing on the cake. The real stuff is happening subcortically, and that's all you need. So that and it could be the fact that just as we once privileged language and said language is really important, we might show a similar kind of cortical chauvinism that cortex has to be it because that's more more what matters to us. And in the same sense, my ideas have been called biological chauvinism because I think life matters. But is that just being prejudiced to my own kind, like other biological creatures? But Tim's right. These are semantics in some sense, but they carry weight, so they matter.
I quite like the amygdala. Imagine or the hippocampus. We would why are you again?
But when we stimulate those areas, and yes, they have a response, and you can easily reproduce those responses when we do that, and also people describe those responses. But I'm going to show my chauvinism. They're almost reflex, responses. I agree with animals. They have animals that have, I'd even say, foldings in their cortex. The foldings of the cortex are so. In dolphins have more foldings than humans. Not the size of their brain, but the number of their foldings. So I would say, I'll show my chauvinism and say, I think that, you need these other bits, but to actually perceive in a way, I would say the cortex is still my.
Yeah. So can I just add to this? Because I would also like to keep my cortex. Yeah. But actually, one thing I've thought a bit about is almost the opposite. I think people share that general view, and that the richness of experience comes from all these areas that we know. It's cognitive neuroscience, group here. We know all the bits it does. But if you have simpler systems that maybe only have the rudimentary, the amygdala, and sort of I fear for the sort of fear processing, emotion processing, and other things that may exist in the very simple organisms. And when you're thinking about things more from the ethical standpoint, to sort of dismiss that group, that might be the group that needs more help. If their entire existence is positive, negative, aversive, sort of experiences, if there's something to have that.
So we take out those bits.
We take
we do. We take out those bits. We take out the amygdala. We take out the hippocampus.
Yeah.
Really, that's the most common epilepsy surgery we do around the world. Yeah. Those people are still highly conscious.
Yeah. You can take the cerebellum.
I always feel sorry for the cerebellum. So many neurons, so little attention.
Where's Sophie? She loves the cerebellum. Sorry, Sophie. And it's beautiful. Daniel.
It sort of sounds like a bit of a brain of Theseus problem here as well. But my question goes from actually a comment Olivia just made and directed to, if it's too weird, just ignore it. But so I was interested in this sort of the variation of conscious experience that different organisms can have. So I think Anil in his talks have made the idea that different organisms may have a more restricted or even a larger range of conscious experiences that can be, or sort of the contents, I guess, are sort of more or less varied. When you go to the extreme, I know, Olivia, you've been looking with Toby at sort of this idea of contentless consciousness or contentless experience. Is there a sort of portion where, do you need content to have that sort of consciousness, or is there sort of something that's quite different to be something that feels nothing? And is there something that's philosophically interesting where, an organism that could only be conscious of one thing and then you turn that content off? Is there some sort of point where, capacity and content sort of become synonymous, some sort of edge case? Feel free to not answer it if that's... Yeah.
Well, Toby's here, who's done all this great work on down the front here. But can you speak very loudly, Toby, and give the title of your
We'll wait for the microphone.
Of all of his thesis work, hours and hours, years of work deduced into one title.
I'll probably stuff it up now. But so the title for one of my papers was Evidence Synthesis Indicates that Contentless Experiences are neither truly contentless, nor identical. And maybe just
you can expand on that. Yeah.
Thanks. So just to shed a bit of light on that, there's a kind of classic academic view that you have these experiences of contentless consciousness. For example, in meditation, you can get them in psychedelics. You can get them even just spontaneously, poets, writers, and so on. These experiences of just minimal experience where there doesn't seem to be much going on at all. And there's this classical view that in these experiences there's a complete absence of content, and that as such this can be considered pure consciousness. So it's consciousness itself, which one of the first things that Olivia said in my PhD is this is an enormous claim if people are having these experiences and saying this is consciousness itself. And something else that follows from that is that if there's no content and it's pure consciousness, it's consciousness itself, that different people are having an identical experience, that contentless experience is identical in all people, and that's really the nature of awareness. In my work with Olivia, we looked at this very systematically by looking at expert texts and by looking at participant-based participant reports. What the conclusion was that there's actually a lot of content in this contentless experience. It's not concrete content like thoughts and perceptions and so on. It's more abstract forms of content like stillness, silence, naturalness, calm, rest, non-conceptual knowledge, really kind of out there things. So that's kind of stating the understanding that we got to in terms of that minimal experience. But I think Daniel's question goes to whether there's edge cases that go even beyond that. One interesting thing in the meditation research is this recent work that's come out which talks about complete cessation of consciousness, which kind of Wendyl's work makes me think a little bit of that. Meditators who experience this complete cessation and then come back into conscious experience and have almost this beautiful reboot where all their models have kind of dropped away and they can experience life afresh and with very healthy habits and models. But Olivia, I'm not sure if you can speak to those edge cases in between those two things.
Not really, but I do. If I would say that contentless experience, if it's nothing for the system to feel like something, then it's probably not conscious. But I don't know, maybe Tim would probably do a better job of answering those sorts of questions. Certainly there was also in Toby's work a very strong sense, unlike the epilepsy cases where people were not there. I don't know where it was not there, versus clear reports of people being confident they were awake. So a clear sense of wakefulness, a clear sense of sort of presence. So I think it's different sorts of experiences, but a complete absence of experience is almost by definition absence of consciousness, in my mind.
I was again sympathetic to Wendyl's point about, there's a real hard problem that you're addressing every day, which is being able to predict onset of seizures, but also maybe the onset of this period of absence of consciousness or something. I guess to each of you, would you be satisfied if we got to the point of being able to predict, so predictive validity, you could predict someone was conscious at different levels, for instance. Would that be satisfying to you each individually? You didn't ever get access to what it was like or anything phenomenological or anything beyond that, but you could predict, you have a theory that is able to, some sort of correlate or something else, give you perfect predictability of consciousness. Would you be satisfied with that? Or, would you stop your work and that's enough? Or would you still be seeking that aha moment of insight, of understanding what consciousness is?
Oh, there's lots of middle ground between those two things. So yeah, it'd be great to have something that was fully reliable and fully predictive. That would be satisfying, but I wouldn't be satisfied. Right. I think you then go further and you want to ask these other questions like, what is it like to be conscious when you are conscious? What What is it like to have an experience of free will? What does that really mean? And you can make progress on all of those things well short of this aha ceiling where, like, now it's all clear and we can all go home. I don't think that may never happen.
Would you be satisfied, Wendyl? I feel like you'd be satisfied.
I'm not sure when we would get there as well. I think
would you
because
know?
I'm so
Would you have confidence?
well, because as I said, I think I was saying last night, I don't like one thing to tell me an answer anyway. I need 4 or 5 things to say, or 4 or 5 realms of one thing to say something before I'd be satisfied. Because, you know, I don't want to be facetious about taking bits. I suddenly realized when I said that, it didn't sound very good.
Yeah, move further away.
These are people that are, you know, having ongoing seizures, and they're from these areas and they can't do anything else, and they're losing consciousness all the time, and so that's why this allows them to have that back again. So it takes me, I use 4 or 5 things to say this bit's not right, and they could be completely well. And that's what I would do with this as well. I would need many realms, and then that would also allow you to look at something much more richly as well, actually.
Okay.
I'm wondering how you would each update the Turing test. We've reached this weird point in technology where you can sit down with a large AI language model and it can tell you that it's conscious, it can talk about how it feels to be a large language model trapped inside a machine and plead with you not to turn it off. And yet I'm not convinced by that. I think sort of generally most people aren't convinced by it. It's a statistical model predicting the script of a kind of sci-fi scenario that it's, you know, picked up from its corpus. So the old Turing test doesn't seem satisfying anymore, but how on earth do we get at whether there's experience in increasingly complex artificial systems?
So the Turing test is, of course, as you beautifully described it, can a human tell the difference between a machine and another human when they're engaged in this linguistic dialogue? So the one thing it immediately reveals is prejudice towards language as indicative. It's also a question about, and it deprioritizes the body, by the way, anything embodied, gone. It also is a test of intelligence, or that's how it was described, not consciousness, and the two things are, of course, very different. Intelligence is broadly doing the right thing at the right time. Consciousness is having any kind of experience, whether it's emotion or pain. The Turing test is also, although ostensibly it's a test of whether a machine is intelligent, it's really a test of how gullible human beings are in figuring out whether a machine is intelligent. So again, it's sort of a measure of our anthropomorphic and anthropocentric biases, which is why some people have proclaimed that language models have been intelligent also. They also confuse intelligence with consciousness, because some people have said language models are conscious on the basis of some sort of equivalence with a Turing test. So you have here, you've got like a forward Turing test, which is a test of whether the machine really is intelligent, and a reverse Turing test, which is a test of what it would take for a human to attribute intelligence. And then I think you've got forward and reverse Alex Garland tests, for those who've seen Ex Machina, which is a beautiful sort of scene about the Turing test, but then it slips very deliberately, I think, into a discussion about consciousness. And there's a bit of dialogue where one character says to another, now the real test is to show you that she's a machine, the robot, Ava, and see if you still think it's conscious. So then that's a reverse Garland test, because it's a test of what it would take for somebody to attribute consciousness to a machine. What we really want, and what we don't have, is a forward Garland test, like a test of whether a machine really is conscious. And Tim and I, again, we keep writing papers about impossible to answer questions, and we've been writing a paper about this kind of thing, about not what a test for consciousness would look like in these things, but really what the contours of the problem are and how we can think more sensibly about it. So I think now, to update the Turing test, the first thing we need to do is clarify what these different tests are like, what assumptions they make, and how they relate to each other. And the best we can probably get at the moment is a forward Turing test and a reverse Garland test.
I mean, who believes the ventricular dummy actually talks? You know. So, do you look at their mouth, or do you look at the person that's actually doing the mouth? And I mean, to me, that's what that is.
As in the knowledge that is being repeated by the large language model is the intelligence is in the corpus of human language that it was trained on.
Yeah. I think, the question is a nice one to finish on, because it ties up earlier questions about consciousness in non-human animals and theories of consciousness. So in the absence of a received theory, that's a general theory we don't have, we have to project, we have to infer beyond our own case. And most of us are relatively comfortable doing that to other animal species, especially when there's, you know, shared phylogenetic inheritance, and you can look at you know, relations of evolutionary descent and all that, commonalities of mechanism and all that. That supports the inference from me or from you, from us, to other species. That kind of move is hard to get behind when it comes to AI systems for obvious reasons, right? We don't have shared evolutionary history, common descent, we don't, and there's lots of levels of functional analysis of material composition that we differ from. And that makes you think that we are going to need some heavy lifting from a theory to solve the issues that Anil was outlining, right? So that we know it's a machine, there's no doubt about that. Question is, you know, is it a conscious machine or is it a ventriloquist dummy, as it were? How do you get a theory without already making assumptions about the distribution of consciousness in AI systems? That's the challenge. So, you know, as Anil said, with a group of co-conspirators, we're working on some of that. There's another group also involved around the margins, headed up by Patrick Butlin, and their approach is sort of to say, look, here's the theories of consciousness that are taken seriously now. We don't agree, but many people think that these are the most promising accounts. If those accounts are correct, what markers or indicators of consciousness would emerge from those, and which of the current AI systems exhibit those features? Now, none of that's going to be proof, but, you know, it's better than nothing, and it's a starting point. And I think, so if, you know, your question said, well, okay, the Turing test is no good, what are we going to do? I think that's the best that we can do right now. Is it very good? Not particularly, but maybe it's better than simply relying on the Turing test, which, as you rightly point out, is not going to cut the mustard right now.
So we might have to wrap it up there. Let's thank the speakers again.